December 1942. In the midst of a world war that consumed entire continents, a quiet revolution began, not with weapons, but with ovens. Somewhere in the Pacific, sailors gathered around a steel-hulled auxiliary ship, watching smoke rise not from gun barrels but from chimneys designed for bread. The United States Navy had deployed something no fleet in history had ever carried before: floating bakeries. At first glance, they seemed absurd, a luxury in the middle of total war. Yet for those who stepped aboard, the smell of warm bread was more powerful than any speech about liberty or democracy. It was proof that even at the edge of the world, America could bring home to its men. The idea had come from the lessons of the First World War, where millions of soldiers had endured moldy rations, canned meats, and bread so hard it cracked teeth. Commanders had learned the bitter truth: hunger broke morale faster than bullets. In 1942, as America mobilized not only its factories but also its kitchens, the Navy authorized specialized auxiliary ships to carry massive ovens, flour silos, and refrigeration units. The goal was simple: produce thousands of fresh loaves every single day, enough to feed entire task forces at sea. Where Japan stretched every grain of rice, America would flood its sailors with abundance. On the deck of one such ship, USS Sylph, sailors lined up with tin trays in hand. They were not about to receive bullets or shells. They were waiting for bread rolls steaming hot, baked less than an hour earlier. Some men swore the smell alone brought them to tears. In letters home, they wrote not about battles or victories, but about the shock of eating bread at sea, soft and warm, as though they had never left home. To the American Navy, morale was a weapon as real as any battleship. Bread was not a treat. It was a strategy. Meanwhile, halfway across the Pacific in Japan's naval bases, mechanics drained fuel from training planes to keep combat aircraft flying. Pilots, many of them barely 20, chewed on cold rice balls before stepping into cockpits for one-way missions. Their hands trembled, not from fear, but from weakness. Malnutrition had stripped them of vision and stamina. At night, some pilots confessed that their eyes failed them. Vitamin deficiency left them unable to see enemy planes in the dark. As American sailors complained when bread turned slightly stale, Japanese warriors fought on empty stomachs. The contrast became undeniable during the Solomon Islands campaign. On Guadalcanal, American forces endured months of bitter fighting, but every week convoys arrived carrying flour, yeast, and sugar. Mobile field ovens churned out fresh loaves by the thousands. Marines described the arrival of bread as though reinforcements themselves had landed. Across the jungle, Japanese troops gnawed dried fish and sipped muddy water, their supply lines strangled by Allied naval superiority. Prisoners taken on the island could hardly believe the food given to them in captivity: bread, butter, coffee. Some stared at it as if it were gold. One officer later confessed in interrogation, "We believed Americans soft, but no man who eats like this could ever be weak." By late 1943, the Navy had perfected the system. Specialized bakery ships carried flour in massive silos capable of storing hundreds of tons. Industrial mixers kneaded dough 24 hours a day. Conveyor belts fed ovens the size of railway cars, producing bread faster than it could cool. Each ship could bake tens of thousands of loaves daily, distributed to destroyers, cruisers, and carriers across entire fleets. Sailors joked that they fought not for the stars and stripes, but for the bread rolls. In truth, many admitted it kept them sane, but the Americans did not stop at bread. Soon came donuts, a symbol so deeply tied to home that it carried power beyond calories. Portable donut machines were installed on bases across the Pacific. Red Cross volunteers, nicknamed Donut Dollies, handed out the fried dough to men returning from combat patrols. On some larger ships, sailors built makeshift fryers to produce hundreds of donuts daily, coated with sugar that glistened like treasure under tropical sun. To bite into one was to remember Main Street, a corner bakery, a childhood long before the war. Donuts became the taste of America, carried into jungles, beaches, and steel decks floating thousands of miles from home. Japanese intelligence could scarcely comprehend reports of these bakery ships. Intercepted manifests showed deliveries of flour and sugar measured in tons. At first they believed it was code. Flour meant gunpowder, sugar meant aviation fuel. Surely no military in history would prioritize dessert while waging the most brutal war mankind had ever seen. But prisoner interrogations confirmed the impossible. American fleets carried bread factories, donut machines, and even cake mixes. For the Japanese Navy, starving for fuel and food alike, the truth was demoralizing beyond imagination. At Truk Lagoon in early 1944, a captured Japanese pilot admitted he had been offered donuts by American sailors after being rescued from the sea. His words, preserved in Allied files, read, "I could not understand. We attacked them with bombs, yet they fed us sweet food. This was not war as we knew it. This was something we could not fight." His testimony circulated secretly among Japanese officers, who quickly suppressed it. Morale could not survive the idea that their enemy possessed not only overwhelming steel, but also endless comfort. On American decks, bread and donuts flowed as freely as ammunition. Men preparing for invasions lined up for fried dough sprinkled with sugar, washed down with coffee. Photographs showed grinning faces, sailors holding donuts as though they were medals. In Okinawa, amid the thunder of kamikaze raids, bakery ships continued their work, ovens running day and night, producing loaves as bombs fell in the distance. One officer later wrote in his diary, "It was madness. We buried our dead at dawn, fought off suicide planes at noon, and ate fresh bread by evening." What America had built was not simply food supply. It was psychological warfare, though not in the traditional sense. Bread and donuts told every sailor that his nation's power was limitless, that even at the farthest edge of the ocean, he would not be reduced to hunger. It reminded them that they fought not only to survive, but to live well. Against an enemy who exalted sacrifice, America demonstrated abundance. Against a culture that worshipped suffering, it showed comfort as strength. By the time 1945 dawned, the bakery ships had become legend. Sailors on destroyers with no ovens of their own sent small boats to the bakery ships, carrying empty crates. They returned with stacks of bread, trays of donuts, even birthday cakes for crew celebrations. Stories spread of captains diverting their vessels briefly, just to collect rations of fresh bread for their men. No one laughed at the absurdity. They knew it kept spirits alive in a war that had consumed millions. In Tokyo, ration lines stretched for blocks. Civilian calories had dropped to levels barely sustaining life. Schoolchildren dug up pine roots for fuel while soldiers at the front dreamed of bowls of rice. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, American sailors argued not over whether they had enough to eat, but over which flavor of donut was best. That difference, invisible to those who believed spirit alone could decide war, was the true battlefield. The first loaves baked at sea in 1942 had seemed like a small comfort. By 1945, they were something greater, a symbol of industrial might, morale strategy, and cultural identity. Bread and donuts became weapons more subtle than bombs, but no less decisive. They told every sailor that his nation could not only fight but also care for him, that in the middle of apocalypse, home could still be tasted. It was a lesson Japan would not understand until it was far too late. In early 1943, the United States Navy expanded its bakery program, transforming the idea from an experiment into a cornerstone of logistics. Where once food was packed in cans and crates, now entire convoys carried flour in bulk, shipped like ammunition. Each sack of wheat was part of a new arsenal, one aimed not at enemy soldiers, but at the hunger that haunted every army in history. Men could march without bullets for a day, perhaps two. But without bread, an army dissolved. America's leaders understood this deeply, and they invested with the same urgency as they did in bombers and tanks. On the deck of a converted cargo vessel in the South Pacific, sailors worked tirelessly inside cavernous holds that had been transformed into bakeries. Enormous mixers spun day and night, their blades churning mountains of dough. The air was heavy with the warmth of yeast and sugar, a scent so out of place in war zones that visiting Marines often stood in stunned silence. Some closed their eyes, pretending for a moment that they were back home in Iowa, or New York or Texas, standing in line at the neighborhood bakery, instead of a steel ship floating between battles. The Navy's reports recorded the astonishing figures. One ship could produce nearly 20,000 loaves of bread a day. Another turned out not only bread, but cookies, pies, and eventually donuts. These weren't luxuries by American standards, but to a sailor halfway around the world, they felt like miracles. Diaries from ordinary men, preserved in archives, spoke of nights when the smell of baking bread drifted across the decks and made hardened sailors weep. Some admitted they dreamed of nothing else. The Japanese enemy, struggling to supply even rice to its troops, could never have imagined such abundance. As the war dragged on, The Navy experimented with variety. Ships began producing rye bread for men from the East Coast, cornbread for Southerners, even sweet rolls that reminded Midwesterners of childhood Sundays. Every bite was a reminder that America did not forget its sons. These choices were not accidental. Commanders believed that catering to regional tastes lifted morale even higher. To eat the food of home while anchored thousands of miles away was to believe, if only for a moment, that the war would end and life would return to normal. At the same time, the Red Cross continued expanding its Donut Dollies program. Women volunteers set up kitchens on bases in New Guinea, the Philippines, and eventually on islands near Japan itself. With portable fryers, they served fresh donuts coated in sugar, handed out with coffee brewed strong enough to fuel men through the long watches of the night. For Marines returning from bloody raids, these donuts were more than food. They were a message. You are not forgotten. You are not alone. One corporal wrote that the taste of a warm donut after surviving an ambush was worth more than a medal. Japanese propaganda tried to exploit this. Leaflets dropped over American positions mocked them as weak, claiming they fought for sweets while Japanese warriors endured starvation with pride. But the propaganda failed. American soldiers laughed as they chewed donuts and drank their coffee. If anything, it strengthened their resolve. They could see the enemy starving, exhausted, unable to match the energy of well-fed troops. The contrast was so stark that it became an unspoken truth. America could outfight Japan because it could outfeed Japan. During the campaigns in the Central Pacific, bakery ships followed invasions closely. As soon as a beachhead was secured, small boats carried bread and donuts ashore. Photographs show Marines crouched in foxholes, holding rifles in one hand and loaves of bread in the other. Some grinned as though they had won the lottery. Commanders noticed the effect. Troops with fresh food fought longer, recovered faster, and endured hardship with greater strength. Medical officers even noted that bread fortified with vitamins helped prevent disease, especially among men fighting in malarial jungles. What looked like comfort food was in fact a form of medicine. By 1944, America's floating bakeries had become a symbol not only for the Navy, but also for the wider war effort. Newspapers back home published stories of ships that baked donuts on the high seas. Families read these accounts with pride, marveling at the ingenuity that could turn a cargo ship into a kitchen. It reassured mothers and wives that their sons and husbands were being cared for, even in distant oceans. The morale boost extended beyond the front lines. It reached into living rooms across America, knitting the home front to the battlefield. In contrast, Japanese letters intercepted by Allied intelligence revealed despair. Soldiers wrote to families about eating grass, roots, and insects. One diary recovered on Saipan told of men surviving on half rations for weeks, their bodies wasting away. Another described stealing food from civilians just to survive. For them, the war had turned into a daily battle against hunger. Against this backdrop, the knowledge that Americans were eating fresh bread and donuts was more than demoralizing. It was humiliating. American sailors began to share stories of encounters with captured Japanese prisoners. Many prisoners could not believe the food offered to them. One told his captors that eating soft white bread was like stepping into another world. Another wept openly when handed a donut, unable to reconcile the sweetness with the bitterness of his own army's conditions. These stories circulated quietly through American ranks, reinforcing the belief that their enemy was collapsing not only from bombs and shells, but from the inability to feed itself. The system worked so well that bakery ships were often escorted as carefully as ammunition carriers. Commanders understood that morale was fragile and that losing the supply of bread could damage spirits just as much as losing a battle. During the invasion of the Philippines, Japanese bombers tried to target logistics ships. Several bakery vessels were attacked, their crews scrambling to defend ovens instead of guns. In one case, sailors fought off an air raid with anti-aircraft guns, then returned immediately to the ovens to keep baking. The men joked afterward that the bread must go on, a parody of the old phrase about the show continuing no matter what. By now, donuts had taken on a legendary status. They were not simply food, but tokens of memory. Men compared them to the donuts sold at fairs, diners, or church fundraisers back home. Eating them became a ritual, something that tied every sailor and soldier to a shared culture. Even those who had never cared for sweets admitted that in the middle of war, a donut could silence despair. Psychologists later argued that these simple foods functioned as powerful morale tools, anchoring men to their civilian identities even as they lived through the chaos of combat. The Japanese command could not match this. Attempts to create field bakeries failed due to lack of wheat and fuel. Rice shortages grew so severe that even officers received reduced rations. Rumors spread of ships rationing soldiers to half a bowl of rice per day, sometimes mixed with sawdust or grass. Against such deprivation, the sight of Americans enjoying bread fresh from ovens seemed like a cruel joke. It reinforced the image of the United States as an enemy with bottomless resources, impossible to defeat. And yet, behind the laughter and donuts, there was also a deeper truth. Many American sailors carried the memory of hunger during the Great Depression. For them, the Navy's bakeries were not only a sign of strength, but also a reminder of what had been overcome. Eating bread and donuts in wartime was proof that America had risen from poverty to power. Each bite symbolized victory, not just over Japan, but over the hardship of the past. By the end of 1944, the floating bakeries had baked millions of loaves and millions of donuts. They had become so essential that men joked they should be awarded medals. Some sailors even proposed naming them ships of morale, for they delivered hope as much as food. In truth, they were unsung heroes of the Pacific War, shaping the spirit of a fleet that seemed unstoppable. The ovens kept turning, the fryers kept sizzling, and the sweet smell of bread and sugar drifted across the Pacific, following the fleet wherever it went, promising victory with every bite. The year was 1944, and the Pacific Ocean had become a battlefield of attrition, stretching over thousands of miles of water and countless islands. The American fleet, now swollen to unprecedented size, moved like a floating city. Within this city, bakery ships had become essential infrastructure. To the casual observer, they were nothing more than auxiliary vessels painted gray and armed lightly. But to the sailors who depended on them, they were cathedrals of comfort, places where the very air smelled of home. At dawn, long before Réveillé, ovens were already burning. The bakers, often young men who had never held a rifle before joining the Navy, worked in endless shifts. Covered in flour, sweating in tropical heat, they turned out loaf after loaf, donut after donut, pie after pie. These men fought not with bullets but with yeast and sugar, yet their contribution to victory was no less vital. Commanders noted that a destroyer, resupplied with fresh bread, fought harder and longer than one living off canned rations. One sailor remembered arriving alongside a bakery ship after 3 weeks of eating nothing but hardtack and canned meat. When he stepped aboard, the smell of baking nearly overwhelmed him. He wrote in his diary that the scent alone lifted his heart more than the news of reinforcements. It was like breathing America again, he confessed. For him, that loaf of bread was more than food. It was proof that civilization still existed beyond the madness of war. Meanwhile, Japanese soldiers and sailors were reduced to desperate measures. Their supply lines had been cut by relentless submarine and air attacks. Convoys rarely made it through. Men survived on a handful of rice, supplemented with wild plants, coconuts, or whatever could be scavenged. In some garrisons, troops mixed rice with ground-up tree bark to stretch rations. On islands like New Guinea, Japanese soldiers were found gnawing on roots, their bodies skeletal, their spirits broken. Against this background, the American habit of eating fresh bread daily was not merely a luxury, but a decisive factor in morale and endurance. The Navy's logistics officers treated flour like treasure. It was stored in massive silos within the bakery ships, guarded almost as fiercely as ammunition. Each delivery was carefully measured, each loaf accounted for. Yet despite the strictness of supply, there was always enough. Men joked that America's real secret weapon wasn't the atomic bomb, but the donut. The joke carried an edge of truth. Historians later argued that the ability to feed troops with fresh, morale-boosting food was one of the hidden strengths of the Allied war effort. During the invasion of Saipan, bakery ships played a silent but crucial role. As Marines stormed the beaches and fought through ferocious resistance, bakery crews were already preparing bread for the thousands of men who would soon need it. By the time the island was secured, sailors and soldiers were eating fresh rolls with butter, an unimaginable luxury in the middle of a battlefield. War correspondents wrote about it with astonishment. One reported that a Marine, his uniform still stained with blood and dirt, held a donut in one hand and whispered, "This is why we'll win." For the Japanese defenders, the contrast was unbearable. Survivors taken prisoner often stared in disbelief at the food given to them. Some refused to eat at first, believing it a trick. When they finally tasted the bread or donuts, many wept openly. Allied interrogators recorded testimony from prisoners who admitted that hunger had weakened their fighting spirit more than bombs ever could. One soldier confessed that he had been unable to hold his rifle steady because of starvation. Another admitted that his unit had lost more men to disease and hunger than to combat. Back in America, the stories of floating bakeries captured the imagination of the public. Newspaper articles described how sailors were eating donuts in the shadow of battle. Families clipped these stories and saved them, reassured that their sons and brothers were not only surviving, but living with some comfort. The government understood the power of these stories and encouraged their spread. Propaganda posters declared that America fed its men better than any enemy ever could. The message was clear. Abundance was victory. Inside the bakery ships, life was relentless but meaningful. Bakers often joked that they never saw combat, yet they carried scars of a different kind. Burns from ovens, blisters from kneading, exhaustion from endless shifts. These were their battle wounds. They listened to the thunder of distant guns while rolling dough, aware that men fighting those battles depended on their work. Some wrote in letters home that they felt guilty for not being in combat, but their comrades insisted that bread was as important as bullets. Without it, no one could fight. By now, donuts had become the unofficial mascot of the fleet. Sailors invented competitions to see who could eat the most in one sitting. Others saved them, wrapped in napkins, as souvenirs or gifts for friends. Some even sent them home when mail ships allowed, though most arrived stale or crumbled. Still, the gesture mattered. Donuts were no longer just food. They were symbols of connection between the front lines and the home front. The Japanese could only watch in despair as these stories spread. Their own propaganda urged soldiers to endure hunger with honor, to embrace sacrifice as proof of loyalty. Yet hunger eroded loyalty faster than any enemy attack. Officers reported mutinies, desertions, and despair spreading through starving units. Against an enemy who ate donuts before battle, they found themselves with empty stomachs and dwindling hope. During the long march toward the Philippines, bakery ships accompanied the fleet like faithful shadows. Every landing was followed not only by engineers and medics, but by bakers and friars. Soldiers joked that America was not conquering islands, it was opening franchises. The humor masked a deeper truth. America's power lay not only in guns and ships, but in the ability to make war feel survivable. While Japan's warriors starved, America's warriors ate donuts and dreamed of going home. By late 1944, the reputation of the bakery ships had grown so great that men volunteered to serve on them, not for safety but for pride. To bake for the fleet was to keep it alive. Commanders spoke of them in reverent tones, calling them morale ships. Every sailor knew the sight of smoke from their ovens meant relief was near. No one doubted their value anymore. They had become as essential as carriers and battleships, though armed only with flour and sugar. And so, amid the greatest naval war in history, a quiet truth emerged. America's strength was not only measured in steel and firepower, it was measured in bread, in donuts, in the ability to remind men of home even as the world burned around them. It was a weapon Japan could never match, a symbol of abundance against scarcity, comfort against suffering. The ovens burned on, day and night, and with each loaf and donut, victory drew closer. In the spring of 1945, as the American fleet closed in on Japan's last defensive ring, the floating bakeries were working harder than ever. The war had entered its most desperate phase. Kamikaze planes dove into ships, entire task forces came under relentless attack, and casualties mounted daily. Yet amid the chaos, the ovens still burned, producing bread and donuts without pause. It was a strange kind of defiance, the smell of sugar and yeast drifting across decks even as alarms screamed and enemy aircraft roared overhead. For the men who fought through this nightmare, the bakery ships were more than just supply vessels. They were lifelines to sanity. A sailor on a destroyer off Okinawa remembered that after one night of suicide attacks, his unit received trays of donuts sent over from a bakery ship. He described how the men, still shaken from explosions and fire, sat in silence biting into the warm dough. For a moment, they forgot the dead and the fear. For a moment, they remembered they were still alive. The Japanese, meanwhile, had nothing left. Supply convoys had collapsed. Civilians in cities like Tokyo and Osaka stood in ration lines for hours, often receiving nothing but scraps of vegetables or thin porridge. Soldiers at the front fared even worse. Reports told of units eating bark, grass, or whatever they could find. Malnutrition crippled entire divisions, leaving them unable to resist American advances. Prisoners captured during the Okinawa campaign confessed they had not tasted bread in years. Some had never eaten a donut in their lives. When offered one, they stared at it in disbelief before taking small, cautious bites. Many broke down crying. The American command understood that morale was now as important as firepower. General Douglas MacArthur himself insisted that troops be supplied not only with weapons, but with fresh bread whenever possible. He believed it reminded men of what they fought for, the comforts of home, the promise of a better world after the war. His staff coordinated closely with the Navy's bakery ships, ensuring that every major landing had a steady flow of bread and donuts waiting once the beaches were secured. At Okinawa, this system reached its peak. Tens of thousands of troops rotated in and out of the front lines, and the bakery ships kept pace. Their ovens ran without pause day and night, producing more than food. They produced morale. A Marine sergeant later recalled that during a lull in the fighting, his squad received not ammunition, but baskets of fresh bread. "It gave us more strength than bullets," he said. "Bullets keep you alive. Bread makes you want to live." Back in the United States, stories of these floating bakeries continued to spread. Newspapers printed photographs of sailors holding trays of donuts, smiling in the middle of war zones. Families found comfort in these images, reassured that their loved ones were not entirely consumed by hardship. Some letters from the front even joked about how the Navy should open a chain of bakeries after the war, using the same equipment that had fed them in battle. To the men who lived through it, the idea was no joke. Bread and donuts had become symbols of survival, but not everyone saw it as lighthearted. Japanese intelligence officers, reading intercepted American newspapers, were horrified by what they learned. They realized that their enemy had such immense resources that it could devote ships to baking pastries while waging total war. In secret reports, they admitted that such abundance was beyond anything Japan could achieve. It reinforced the grim reality. Japan was fighting an enemy whose industrial and logistical power was infinite compared to its own. On the ground, Japanese soldiers knew this truth even without reports. They felt it in their stomachs. On Okinawa, defenders who survived the initial battles were soon too weak to fight. Their weapons mattered little when their bodies could no longer obey them. Disease spread rapidly through malnourished ranks. By contrast, American forces, fueled with bread, donuts, and fortified rations, kept their strength even through months of brutal combat. The floating bakeries also became symbols of resilience in the face of kamikaze terror. Several times, bakery ships themselves came under attack. One was hit by shrapnel, damaging its deck, but the ovens continued to run. Sailors repaired holes in the hull during the day and baked at night. When asked why they didn't stop, one baker replied simply, "The men are counting on us." Their determination became legendary in the fleet. Sailors joked that no bomb could stop the donuts. As victory in the Pacific drew near, the role of food in shaping morale became impossible to ignore. Military psychologists studied letters and diaries, concluding that fresh food, especially bread and donuts, had kept men emotionally stable through the worst conditions. Unlike canned meat or hard biscuits, these foods carried memories of childhood, family, and normal life. They gave men something to hold on to beyond the battlefield. Without them, psychologists warned, morale might have collapsed under the weight of endless combat. Even after the fall of Okinawa, the ovens did not rest. Plans were already underway for the invasion of Japan itself. Commanders calculated the needs of millions of men who would be thrown into what promised to be the bloodiest campaign of the war. Among the preparations were detailed schedules for bakery ships, ensuring that bread and donuts would flow to the beaches just as surely as tanks and artillery. For the American planners, victory was unthinkable without them, yet the invasion never came. In August 1945, atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Japan surrendered. The bakery ships, still loaded with flour and sugar, suddenly found themselves without a war to fight. Their ovens cooled, their mixers went silent. Some sailors felt relief, others confusion. They had spent years feeding fleets only to see the war end in a way no one had predicted. But their legacy was undeniable. For the Japanese, surrender revealed the full extent of their hunger. Occupation forces discovered cities on the verge of famine, children stunted by years of malnutrition, soldiers little more than skeletons. In stark contrast, American troops marched through the streets carrying donuts and handing out bread to civilians. For the defeated, the smell of American baking was the smell of survival. For the victors, it was the final proof that abundance had triumphed over scarcity. The floating bakeries had never fired a shot, yet they had helped win the war. They had kept sailors and soldiers strong, steady, and hopeful through years of horror. They had shown that war could be fought not only with weapons, but with the promise of home. And in the end, they had become one of the quiet, unsung heroes of the Pacific, a story told not in gunfire, but in the soft crack of a loaf's crust and the sweetness of a sugared donut. When Japan finally surrendered, the guns went silent, but the ovens of the floating bakeries did not stay cold for long. Almost immediately, the ships that had once fed fleets of sailors turned their efforts toward a new mission, feeding the defeated. In ruined cities where families searched through rubble for scraps, the sudden appearance of warm bread or sweet donuts felt like a miracle. Children, many of whom had grown up knowing only hunger and fear, lined up for food from the same men who had been their enemies weeks before. Accounts from occupation records describe moments of pure astonishment. Japanese civilians, gaunt from years of rationing, could hardly believe what they were handed. A piece of bread, soft and fresh, was more than food. It was proof that the war was truly over. A young boy in Yokohama, upon tasting his first donut from an American bakery ship, asked through an interpreter if this was medicine. The sweetness was so unfamiliar he thought it must be a cure for sickness. For many Americans, this act of feeding the enemy carried deep meaning. Sailors who had lost friends to kamikazes or seen cities burn now stood on docks giving donuts to children who bowed politely in thanks. Some felt conflicted, unable to reconcile the kindness they were offering with the hatred they had carried. Others found it healing. One baker wrote home that giving bread to Japanese families was the first time he felt the war had ended inside him. When they ate, he wrote, "I finally stopped feeling like an enemy." The bakery ships also became symbols of the strange new world that followed surrender. Just as they had represented abundance in war, they now represented the power of reconstruction. American commanders recognized that feeding Japan was essential to preventing chaos. Starvation could lead to rebellion, disease, or resistance. Bread and donuts, as simple as they seemed, became tools of stability. Within months, bakery ships and shore-based ovens were producing food not just for American troops, but for civilians across the occupied islands. Japanese soldiers returning from battlefields were among those who felt the greatest shock. Many had lived on rice balls and roots during the final campaigns. Captured diaries revealed men who went days without eating. Now, disarmed and exhausted, they were given fresh bread by the very enemy they had been taught to hate. Some broke down in shame, others in gratitude. A former Japanese officer later wrote, "I could not understand why they fed us. We had expected death, not kindness. When they gave us donuts, I realized everything our leaders told us had been lies." For the Americans, this was not simply generosity. It was also strategy. Food created trust faster than speeches or propaganda. Where weapons had crushed Japan's armies, bread softened its people. The smell of donuts carried a message more powerful than leaflets dropped from the sky. The war was finished, and a new future was beginning. The bakery ships were quietly shaping that future, one loaf at a time. Among Japanese civilians, memories of those first encounters with American food lasted a lifetime. Survivors interviewed decades later recalled the taste of bread and donuts more vividly than any bomb. An old woman from Nagasaki remembered her first donut in September 1945, saying it was the sweetest thing she had ever eaten. She kept the paper wrapping for years as a reminder of the day hunger ended. Children who grew up during the occupation often associated donuts with peace, a strange but enduring legacy of the war. At the same time, the presence of bakery ships reminded Americans of what had made their victory possible. Soldiers and sailors, still stationed far from home, continued to receive fresh bread daily. The contrast between their abundance and the scarcity around them reinforced the lesson of the war. America's strength came not only from weapons, but from its ability to provide comfort even in the harshest circumstances. One naval officer put it simply in a post-war report, "We did not just outfight Japan, we outfed them." The floating bakeries, once symbols of morale at sea, had become instruments of diplomacy on land. Their flour, sugar, and yeast did more than sustain troops. They softened the image of an occupying power. Every loaf carried a message that America's victory was not only military but moral, that it had the capacity to rebuild as well as destroy. In this way, the ships that once filled sailors' helmets with donuts now filled a broken nation with the first taste of recovery. The story spread quickly. American journalists visiting occupied Japan reported on the sight of children holding donuts, their faces still dirty from rubble but glowing with smiles. The images were published back home, showing families that their sons were no longer just fighting, but healing. It reassured a war-weary public that something good could come out of years of destruction. Yet for many Japanese, the feeling was more complicated. Accepting food from the former enemy carried shame. Some elders refused bread at first, calling it humiliating. But hunger has no pride, and slowly resistance gave way to necessity. Within months, even the most reluctant accepted the loaves. Bread became part of daily survival, and with it came the slow realization that America was not leaving. The ovens of the floating bakeries marked the beginning of a long occupation, one that would reshape Japanese society. By late 1945, as the world tried to understand the meaning of the atomic bomb and the collapse of an empire, the humble bakery ships faded quietly into the background. They did not appear in headlines or victory parades. But for those who ate their bread, whether sailor or civilian, they remained unforgettable. The war had been defined by fire, steel, and sacrifice, but its peace was introduced with something softer: the warm taste of bread, the sweet comfort of a donut, and the quiet work of bakers who carried no weapons but helped end a war all the same. The war in the Pacific had been fought with bombs, torpedoes, and fire, but in its quiet corners it was also fought with bread and donuts. For the Americans, food was never only about survival. It was about identity, morale, and the ability to project strength in ways the enemy could not match. The floating bakeries and donut factories symbolized a nation whose industrial power was so vast that it could afford to turn ships into kitchens, even in the middle of the most brutal war in history. Sailors who had once feared torpedoes began to remember instead the smell of fresh loaves rising from steel ovens deep inside the ships. Soldiers who went into battle with mud on their boots carried with them the taste of donuts fried only hours before. These details, small in the scale of war, became enormous in the memories of those who lived them. They proved that even amid chaos, a sense of home could be recreated, and that the spirit of a nation could be baked into something as simple as bread. On the other side, Japan's soldiers and civilians learned what it meant to fight a war without abundance. Their rations grew thinner, their energy weaker, until even the most disciplined warrior could not ignore the hunger that gnawed at him. Diaries found after battles revealed men dreaming not of medals or victory, but of rice, fish, and warmth. The contrast between a sailor biting into a donut on a carrier deck and a Japanese pilot flying on an empty stomach told the story of two nations divided not just by ideology, but by food itself. When the fighting ended, it was that difference which carried forward into peace. The bakery ships and their ovens became part of the occupation, serving loaves to the hungry and donuts to children who had never tasted sugar before. In doing so, they turned enemies into witnesses of America's strength, not the strength of weapons, but of comfort, abundance, and generosity. Bread became diplomacy, donuts became peace offerings, and food became the quiet ambassador of a new era. For the Americans, it was proof of what victory meant. They had not only crushed an empire, they had done so while never running out of the little luxuries that made life worth living. In their eyes, this was the ultimate demonstration of power. To fight a global war and still have the capacity to make something sweet, something warm, something human. For the Japanese, it was a lesson written in sugar and flour. The empire that had promised sacrifice and glory had delivered only hunger, while the enemy who brought destruction also brought bread. In time, those first donuts given to children in Yokohama and Nagasaki would become memories told to grandchildren, stories of the strange days when the conquerors fed the conquered, and the sailors who worked those ovens would return home, proud not just of battles won, but of the loaves they had baked and the comfort they had carried across oceans. The floating bakeries and donut ships never earned the fame of carriers or battleships. They did not appear in history books as decisive weapons. Yet their impact was undeniable. They reminded both friend and foe that war is not only measured in victories and defeats, but in the human details that carry through the smoke and silence. In the end, the war that began with fire and fury ended for some, with the soft taste of bread and the sweetness of a donut. And perhaps that is the strangest truth of all, that in the vast story of World War II, one of its quiet symbols of victory was not a bomb or a bullet, but the warm scent of baking carried across the Pacific.